glucose is regulated and what happens there, but what are the molecular mechanisms behind it? And it's awesome. Just fascinating, really. Essentially, for insulin signaling, I mean. Glucagon is not, it's still exciting, but not, in my opinion, that much. Now, I won't be able to picture, so I will use the mouse, okay? You will still see the video with my voiceover, but I will use the mouse. So, you've got a glucose in the blood, elevated. You see that elevated thing here? Elevated glucose. It goes into the cell through the carrier, glucose carrier, GLUT2, the molecule right here. When there's more glucose outside, more glucose will enter the cell. And the first thing glucose is going to be used in is energy, yeah, glycolysis. Glycolysis, oxidative phosphorylation, and so on and so forth. So it will increase levels of ATP in the cells, in the beta cells. Now ATP here serves as the inhibitor of potassium channel. Okay? When potassium channel is inhibited, potassium, instead of leaving the cell, stays in the cell. Potassium is positively charged. When you keep positive charges inside of the cell, what's going to happen to the membrane potential of the cell? It's going to go up. We call it depolarization. Cell depolarizes. Usual response to depolarization, opening of calcium channels. Make sense? When you open calcium channels, you have a release of insulin. Elegant? In my opinion, fantastic. Actually, there is a drug that we will talk about, the class of drugs that is called sulfonylurea drugs. They additionally inhibit potassium channel and increase insulin levels even more. The more you inhibit this channel, more the longer depolarization is going to be, more calcium is going to enter, more insulin is going to get released. Does that make sense? Well, guess what these drugs are used for? Treatment. Diabetes. Anyone is familiar with types of them? Like type 1, type 2? Well, if not, that's fine. But increasing insulin release from your pancreas will treat what type of diabetes? Type 2. Type 1 is what? Huh? Insulin dependent, which means you do not produce insulin. So, I mean, you can bath the patient in sulfonylurea, but they don't make insulin. Okay? So, insulin, instead, you see those pentagons here. It binds to the receptor. The receptor is tyrosine kinase receptor in the cell membrane. Tyrosine kinase immediately phosphorylates a whole bunch of proteins. And these proteins then constitute increased transport of glucose. You simply have more carriers, glucose carriers in the membrane. They travel there. It's like a switch. They phosphorylate it, they go to the membrane. Phosphorylate it, go to the membrane. Does that make sense? Okay? And a bunch of proteins that are responsible for typical glucose utilization pathways. Okay? Synthesis of fat, synthesis of glycogen, growth, even protein synthesis. Does that make sense? So glucose induces insulin. Pretty much glucose uptake induces insulin through these two steps. Inhibition of potassium channels, which depolarizes cell and opens calcium channels. And then insulin stimulates glucose utilization in the cell. Yes?
So is that why even if like you have type 2 diabetes and
yes.
you like even
excellent question. So why do you need to give insulin to people with type 2 diabetes? You also have a question? No? Okay. So, well, we're kind of jumping ahead, but I like when it's like a clinical question. So if people with type 1 do not make any insulin, let's put them on the back burner. People with type 2 do make insulin. But when they eat something that contains, well, pretty much everything contains carbohydrates, they still have to take insulin. Why people who produce insulin still have to take it? What you can say about the insulin levels that they make? Actually, by the standards, they aren't low, but they are insufficient for them. So they have to have higher levels of insulin. Why? I'm tempted to ask, but it's going to be a very personal question and nobody's going to answer positively. So I will not ask it as a personal, but what happens to people who do drugs? What happens to the dose with time? They increase the dose. Why? Yes, because they develop tolerance. So people, now think about this. Imagine I live sedentary lifestyle and I eat like, that would be a disaster. Well, say anything I want to. 2 dozens of donuts a day. What's going to happen to my blood glucose? It's going to go up. It's going to happen to the insulin levels. They're going to go up. After that, what's going to happen to my blood glucose in first day of that lavish lifestyle? If insulin level goes up, what happens with glucose? Yeah, it's going to go down. Insulin will interact with receptors, right? Everything goes smooth. For some reason, and we don't know the exact molecular mechanism, underlying mechanism, we have some parts of the puzzle. If people who eat whatever they want, they constantly have elevated glucose levels, which means they constantly have high levels of insulin. So their cells, muscle cells and liver cells, become resistant to insulin. So they have to shoot themselves with higher levels of insulin all the time to take glucose in. Because that level that they produce, which is usually normal, like you take a person with type 2, you take a healthy person, they have same insulin levels. But for type 2 patients, it's too low. They have to have more. Does that make sense?
So is it like, it has to do with the, you said like if you're like tolerant basically,
Yeah.
does it have to do with them with like the receptor?
Something, we don't know. The idea is something downstream from the receptor. So receptor will, insulin will still bind to the receptor. But something is screwed up inside of the cell. Something here doesn't work. Does that make sense? It's pretty fascinating. And I was at the presentation. It was the obesity conference. Pretty interesting, by the way. And the keynote speaker, she said that focus of clinical studies and diabetes management approaches should be not on how else we can increase insulin in those poor patients, but how can we change lifestyle so the resistance to insulin can be decreased, so they will become sensitive to it again. It's actually quite interesting. We'll chat about it. Okay, few features of glucose. First of all, the production of insulin following the elevation of glucose is pretty fast. So this is the levels. The higher the glucose, the higher the levels of insulin. They will reach saturation Obviously, your pancreas cannot produce unlimited amounts. Does that make sense? Second, it happens really, really, really fast. So this is the insulin levels in response to the like glucose injection. That make sense? Now this is an interesting graph which I always want to explain. So this shows you the dependence of glucose inside the cell versus glucose outside of the cell. You understand? So we have cell, we'll have to picture. We have cell, we have glucose here, and we have glucose outside of it. Does that make sense so far? Now, glucose that's outside, the extracellular one, comes from food. We eat it. Glucose that's inside the cell, where does it come from? From outside, right. It comes from outside. What if we get rid of insulin? What if we will take rats and cut out their pancreas? You see, intracellular glucose does not respond to elevating levels of extracellular glucose. So no matter how much glucose is outside of the cell, it's not going to get in if you don't have pancreas. Does that make sense? You get pancreas in, you get insulin, more glucose out, more glucose in. Does that make sense? It just shows you the effects of insulin and the uptake. Very convincing. What if insulin is absent, like in type 1, or there's no pancreas? Since insulin is absent, there's no uptake of glucose into the cell, right? So we stick with that green line here. No glucose inside of the cell means we don't have what? Which source of what? Yeah, but we're going to die if we don't have source of energy, so we got to use something else. What's the next in-line source of energy? After glucose, huh? Fat. Yeah, we're going to use fat. So insulin, in fact, inhibits the lipase hormone that breaks down, enzyme that breaks down fat. When insulin is gone, enzyme is not inhibited anymore, and it starts to break down fat. Fat is broken down into two major components. Triglycerides are broken down into free fatty acids, FFA, and triglycerides, glycerol. Free fatty acids and glycerol. So what you're going to see in people with type 1 diabetes that do not have insulin, okay, if you don't give them insulin, which is cruel by itself, you're going to see the elevation of free fatty acids in the blood, because they are the product of fat breakdown. You will also see the elevation of blood glucose, because cells cannot take it in, and all glucose accumulates in the blood. We didn't quite discuss it yet, but if you remember, metabolism, like the respiration pathway, at some point there's acetyl-CoA there. Acetyl-CoA enters the Krebs cycle. When there is no available glucose, and glucose is in the blood but not in the cell, cells have to start making their own glucose, and they use for it components of the Krebs cycle. So essentially Krebs cycle becomes shut down in those patients. Acetyl-CoA is now kind of useless. It goes into the liver, where it is converted into so-called ketone bodies. One example of ketone bodies is acetoacetic acid, Another example is acetone. People with diabetes type 1, which did not take their insulin shot, develop the acetone breath. Have you ever heard about it? You can smell acetone in the breath. That's serious symptom. This ketone bodies like this acetone and acetoacetic acid decrease blood pH, causing acidosis. Causing acidosis. What happens to neuronal activity when pH goes down? Yeah, it is depressed. So people go into coma. That's why diabetic coma is happening. Okay, it's not going to happen like after probably one missed insulin shot, but after several, when acidosis kicks in far enough. Does that make sense? That's your physiological explanation. Higher free fatty acids may also contribute to atherosclerosis, but it's more controversial. It's people with type 1 diabetes are more prone to vascular diseases. Interesting thing. You think about performance enhancement drugs. Well, I don't know. I don't really frequently think about performance enhancement drugs, but if you think about it, those people, the athletes that take them, especially for muscle building, they don't just take testosterone or growth hormone. They take cocktails of them. And one component of the cocktail is insulin. Turns out that growth hormone, like take the rat, cut out pancreas and pituitary gland. So no growth hormone production, no insulin production. Rats have stunted growth. Here, you see? You add growth hormone, you start inject growth hormone, nothing changes. You start inject insulin, not really, no. You start inject both, they grow. So those athletes, the performance, the bodybuilders, they use a regimen which includes GH, testosterone, and insulin, because without it, increased insulin allows them to uptake amino acids and stimulate protein synthesis. Does that make sense? Insulin additionally stimulates protein synthesis. It's another anabolic hormone. So what can stimulate secretion of insulin? Food. When you eat, your blood glucose goes up, your blood fat, free fatty acids go up, your amino acids go up. It all happens after you had a meal. Insulin goes up. Also, secretion of hormones of digestive tract that are associated with the food intake, that are produced when you eat. They will additionally stimulate insulin. Glucagon. Isn't that strange? But glucagon stimulates insulin. Glucagon is another hormone. Remember that decreases glucose, that increases glucose. So they play that seesaw, okay? If glucagon is produced, glucose is about to rise. To counterbalance potential problems, insulin is released. So they like constantly play against each other. It's like a tug of war, okay? Growth hormone, cortisol, stimulates insulin release, because while cortisol increases blood glucose, insulin helps to take it into the cells. Well, parasympathetic, digestive. When you rest and digest, you have parasympathetic stimulation, increases insulin. Beta-adrenergic, specific to the blood vessels. Insulin resistance and obesity. In obesity, you actually produce more insulin because you're resistant. And those drugs that I told you, sulfonylurea drugs. What decreases secretion? Fasting. So it's interesting. Another explanation why, if you hit the gym in simultaneous attempts to lose weight and build muscles, it's not going to happen. It's either one or another. Because if you're losing weight, essentially you are in a fasting regimen. You take in less calories than you spend, which means insulin is going to be inhibited, anabolic activities in the muscle are going to be down. Okay, does that make sense? Obviously, decreased blood glucose, leptin, one of my favorite hormones. Leptin is the hormone of satiety. Have you heard? What is satiety? Huh? No. Insatiated. Yes, you're full. Okay, like when people are insatiable, they just can't get enough of something. Okay, so satiety is feeling of being full, and I always say that leptin is the only hormone which we can consciously overcome. I did it multiple occasions. Like you feel you had enough food, but you just can't resist these 2 slices of pizza. Okay, that makes sense? Okay. Okay, I can't resist. I love this. I was working in obesity for a long time, and just it's interesting. It's just why I find obesity so fascinating. First of all, I think that obesity treatments like drugs are, I am sorry, not, I want to say bullshit, but I should say not working. But it's kind of the cause of obesity in 99% cases are not physiological. The causes are social, economic, usually both, lifestyle, okay, for obesity. Diabetes type 2 here is linked to it. Type 1 is, it's not somebody's fault, it's genetic. It is usually autoimmune. So there's antibodies attack beta cells die, no insulin production. So people depend on the insulin pump or insulin injections pretty much forever. Now they start making actual insulin pumps that are awesome. So you carry a little machine with you, and as far as I know, bless you, they have clinical trials. So machine will test your blood constantly, measure glucose levels, and inject insulin only when you need it. I don't know if they are like they've already sold or something, but they definitely test them. Now type 2 is more fascinating. It usually has a later onset, and it's a consequence of the lifestyle. Genetic component contributes to it, no doubt. Some people are more sensitive, more prone to type 2 than others. Okay? And it's characterized by production of insulin. But as we just discussed, people become insulin resistant. Now let's talk about rates. Okay? So this is rates of diabetes in the United States in 2010. You can see this dark spot here, especially Texas, Mississippi, and Alabama. South Carolina doesn't look good as well, and this is West Virginia, of course. 5 million people, 5 last names. You haven't heard this? This is increase, so that shows you dynamic. Which states, so like whiter states show kind of lower growth in rates. Blue states show higher. To be honest, I'm not surprised that Louisiana or Mississippi are not showing high increase. Higher than they already have. They have like skyrocketing rates of diabetes. And this is your BMI, the obesity rates. So this is the obesity, this is diabetes. You can definitely say that rates of obesity correlate with the rates of diabetes. That was the best map I could find. But in fact, if you would do slightly different breakdown, maybe more detailed, like not every 10%, okay, or every, like, a little bit different breakdown will show you that there is what I call obesity belt. It starts in Texas with obesity rates higher than 30%. Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, West Virginia, Kentucky. I don't think Ohio hits 30 yet. Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, southern, southeast, south central and southeast are notorious. And any guesses about one northern state? That arch rival? Michigan, yes. Genetically, African American population is more predisposed to obesity. A larger percent of African American population in Michigan is reflected in the higher obesity rates. Same goes for the South. Okay? State with the lowest obesity rates. Nope. Because Latino ethnicity is also genetically predisposed to obesity. Not state yet. New Mexico. I thought Mexico. It was overly optimistic. No, New Mexico, again, a lot of Latino population. Low, but not the lowest. Nobody lives there. Colorado, yes. All healthy white people, rich healthy white people live in Colorado. Bike riding, running, and all other endurance sports. Lowest. They hit 20% mark a couple of years ago.
Does that like also all those like Southeast like and Tennessee, but also does it have to do with like
Food?
Yeah.
It's good. It's good. Food is good.
It's good.
But it's so unhealthy. I know. Yes, absolutely. A lot of fried stuff. And look, it's not canola oil. It's a lot of lots of shortening, a lot of trans fat. So obesity, and if you will compare obesity rates and diabetes rates, they're going to coincide pretty nicely. And that's the problem. And I always say that treating obesity, I can treat obesity very easy. I can chain someone to the pole in my basement, and I will choose the diet. And the person will be healthy. My colleague, Dr. Nussbaum, he made perfect case. When we say some people are more sensitive to developing diabetes than others, it is true. There is a genetic component. But he suggests that there are ways to make all people free from type 2 diabetes, or make all people have it. No matter what your genetics is, if you will be trapped, that's not my words, that Dr. Nussbaum's words. If you're trapped in the room surrounded by the boxes of Oreo, and the only way to get to the restroom is to eat your way through it, by the time you end up in the restroom, you have diabetes. Okay? And the only drink that you have is Coke, not Diet Coke. Okay? So much sugar will give you diabetes, no matter what your genetics is. Other side of the spectrum, if you're going to have 3 meals a day, which will consist of nuts, vegetables, and chicken breast, and you have to run 3 miles before you have a meal, you will never get diabetes type 2. No matter how much you eat of that stuff. That makes sense? Okay. It is time to pause.